Hello there, my name is Liz Saunders. I work as part of the faculty at the Leadership Academy and spend my life working with different individuals and organisations, mostly in the NHS, in the field of leadership and organisational development.
Hello, and I'm Simon Bird. I'm also a member of the Leadership Academy faculty. I work with organisations across the health service and beyond, with people at all different stages in their career.
And we're doing a series of conversations, overheard conversations, if you like, on different topics, which we hope will be easily digestible and give you some helpful pointers in your leadership journey.
So today we want to talk about compassionate leadership. We finally got to this point of talking about compassionate leadership after Liz and I have had an exchange about, do we need to talk about compassionate leadership? And this was partly because of my observation that in the health service and beyond, but I think particularly in the health service, there's been enormous focus around compassion and compassionate leadership. And I am wondering what that genuinely means to different people. So is compassion about being nice to people? Is it about letting them off the hook when things are tough? Is it about putting your figurative arm around them during the times of a pandemic, going, it's okay, we can all be in this together? Or is it something else? And I know there's a body of knowledge which suggests it's more than that. So hence here we are talking about it and what it might mean. So I think we're going to explore three things: what it is, and whether it matters, and whether you can develop it. So, I mean, Liz, you have a different take on what compassionate leadership is?
Well, I think I'm kind of interested in how it's evolved and how the conversation about it has evolved. So I think if we kind of wind back to 2019 and pre-pandemic, there was some quite compelling work coming out of the King's Fund led by Susie Bailey and Michael West about compassionate leadership, and about how compassionate leadership is about creating conditions through doing things that you've sort of described: having empathy, listening really well, helping people, doing that caring stuff, but creating those conditions to make it possible to have tough performance management conversations, or whatever tough conversations might be needed. So I think whilst the kind of headline compassionate leadership can kind of take you down there, oh, this is just about being nice to people, I think the body of knowledge, as you described, coming out of the King's Fund in 2019 was suggesting, no, it's something more. Then we get pandemic, don't we? So then it gets interesting, because what happens then? Do we get compassionate leadership coming to the fore, or do we get something else? And I think at a time of crisis, the temptation is we go down much more kind of command and control. And I think I've seen some evidence of that, certainly at the beginning of 2020, at the beginning when the pandemic was taking hold, much more in that kind of position. And then I think we've seen a real emphasis in the NHS on well-being, and that's those sorts of interventions. How do we keep people okay? And therefore this idea of compassionate leadership to take us through the latter phases, let's hope, of the pandemic and into a new normal. I think the conversation about compassionate leadership is coming back to the fore. Like, what kind of leadership will take us onto the next stage and enable everybody to remain intact? So then I think it gets interesting again, particularly if people are reverting to this thought of, well, compassionate leadership is just about empathy. And I think that absolutely is space for really good listening to one another about what the last few months have been like for people, and understanding what it's like for all the different players in the system. And the question is, and then what? And I think that's where we get into more interesting territory about, well, what does the evidence show? The evidence shows that if you get this compassionate leadership thing right, then you're going to get people who are more connected to one another psychologically. They're going to be more committed to the organisation, which is going to be important, kind of taking things forward. They're more likely to be compassionate to other people, and they're less likely to have burnout when you're talking about those delivering frontline clinical care, which, given what everybody's been through, is a real risk at the moment. So I think there is a real sort of business case for doing this, and we need to get quite granular on what it is and what it isn't.
So that's interesting. I wondered, I was thinking as you were talking then whether this really matters. And what I mean by that is, don't confuse me, I do like to think I do have some empathy with people, or whether some people might just say, do you know what, this is just good leadership. Compassionate leadership isn't anything different from providing clarity to people, checking in with them, and following up on results. Is there any difference? Does it matter?
I think it does matter. Is there any difference? I suppose, well, there's a kind of chicken and egg question, isn't it? Are great leaders because they are compassionate leaders? Or they have some of these attributes in their leadership. So you're saying, some of this is about listening well to people. Well, that's what good leaders should be doing anyway. Yeah. I would agree with you there. I mean, I think there was an article published in the Harvard Business Review last December. We can put a link in for people who are watching this to look at later on, which I thought was really interesting because it started to try and itemize out, right, what is this thing, and how do we get beyond just the nice bit of it? And what the authors there were suggesting is that some people are kind of good on the compassion bit, so good on the putting their arms around people bit, but then feel hamstrung to be able to make the tough decisions, which actually, if you're looking at effective leadership, you've got to have people who are able to do that. And I was in conversation with somebody about this just the other day, and they were saying, yeah, actually thinking about it, I mean, it's not compassionate to not identify poor performers. Is it? It's not compassionate to the poor performer themselves, and it's certainly not compassionate to the other people in the team that are left just having to kind of pick up the slack. So what the Harvard Business Review authors start to talk about is there's another layer on top of this, which is about leadership wisdom. So what you need is to have the compassion, if we're saying this is the kind of layman's terms of being nice to people and listening and having empathy, but you also need to have some leadership wisdom there to get into this place of wise compassion. And the leadership wisdom is about really knowing what's going on, being able to have those tough conversations, having some candor about how you go about doing business. So it's not just, oh yes, isn't it awful and I'm really sorry for you, but it's, let me understand the situation you're in, and let me look at that against the business context, and therefore get into what would be quite a difficult conversation about whether you're in the right place at the moment, or what we might need to do organisationally to help support you, so on and so forth.
Okay, so I think if I understand what you're saying then, so we are saying, yes, the empathy piece is really important. The figurative arm is really important. Understanding what's going on in other people's lives is really important. But then there's this word and we need to place this in business context. So as opposed to just stopping after the isn't life really, really hard. So I think that's where some of the confusion does happen, and where, I mean, certainly I do think compassion, there's a certain weariness of that. Some people go, oh, we're going to talk about compassionate leadership again, try my best. So that's really helpful. So so can you develop that in other people? How can you develop compassionate leadership?
Well, I think if you break it down in that way, then you're looking at two skill sets.
Yeah.
So the first skill set you're looking at is the kind of pure compassion, I guess. So your ability to listen really well. And when you were talking before and saying, listen with empathy, it's easy, isn't it, to be like, oh yeah, no, I know I've got to do that, but are you really able to do that? And how are you kind of disciplining yourself to really understand what it's like for that other person? So there are tools out there, empathy maps, that sort of thing that can help you think through, well, what's it really like from somebody else's perspective? And I think that there's something here about, so if we stay in this compassion side of things, what about self-compassion? How are you treating yourself at the moment through this? Are you able to let go of some of your self-criticism? Are you able to kind of talk about yourself positively to yourself? Are you thinking, when you get into these interactions with other people, what is it really like for them? How can I best see things from their perspective? What can I do best to help them? And how can you practice empathy like a muscle. So when you go into those conversations, you think, oh, I want to understand it from other people's point of view. Are you going in there kind of agendaless? Are you really able to sit with that person and listen to them and what life is like for them and play that back to them and be with them in that, rather than thinking, oh no, I have to do a bit of listening and then we can get down to the business of the day. So I think there's a kind of bucket of stuff that we can practice when it comes to the pure compassion piece. And
that's the first set. Yeah,
that's the first set.
Yeah.
And then if we're talking about the wisdom piece, the leadership wisdom, as the Harvard Business Review authors would contend, then there's a different skill set there. So it might be that you feel very able to get alongside people and to be with people and to listen to them, but actually this kind of tough conversations bit is the bit that feels, well, no, I'm not quite sure. So there's something there about transparency. So how do you look at the candor in your leadership? Are you being honest with individuals and with teams? And how can you practice that? And it might be small things to start with to kind of get your eye in. How do you practice having more assertive interactions? And let's remember, when we're talking about being assertive, we're not talking about kind of my needs are more important than your needs. It's about saying, your needs are important and my needs, the business needs, are important, and how do we get to a place where we can do something proactive about that? So how do you, so practicing some assertion around that, and how do you kind of keep yourself really focused in the present and what's going on now, rather than just feel the burden of what everybody's been through for the past year. And I think this will be a real challenge for leaders and people working in frontline care. Like the legacy of what's happened in the last year is going to weigh heavy, and we're going to need to move care on for patients and move the context on for staff. So how do you hold those things in tension of people have had a really tough time and we need to create a new normal and bring people along with us? So I think how do you kind of practice being in the present? Maybe that is some mindfulness, maybe that is some like, let's really look at what the context is now. I know that is where we have recently been, but what's really going on now, so that we can be honest with people about the situation as it now is, rather than where it was 6 months ago. That
sounds like that's really helpful and challenging for people. Sure. And I think maybe, so it sounds, the search is what we're trying to understand is this sweet spot, isn't it, between, I was thinking in my mind as you were talking, there's this spectrum. So at the one end, we've just got like pure compassion, empathy, only compassion. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got like business performance, we've got delivery against KPIs. And some people will be really pulled towards that coming out of the pandemic. And it sounds like where leaders wouldn't it be great if we could try to work out how to be in the middle of that, like somewhere in the middle of that spectrum and hold both those.
I think that's absolutely right. And how do you handle this next period with emotional intelligence? How do you know what, and I think it is about as much as attending to what's going on for you and being conscious of that, as well as attending to what's going on for other people. So I think this self-compassion piece is really important in that.
Great. I think that's us trying to answer those two questions.
Yeah, hopefully that's helpful, and we will add a slide with some references that can direct people to further reading if this is of interest for you.